There's a point in the inner work where you stop trying to feel better and you start trying to see better. Not how do I reduce this feeling, but what does this feeling reveal about how I'm built, what I expect, and what I believe I deserve? You're close to that point now. Most people use their emotional life as a verdict. I feel it, so it must be the whole truth. I've reacted that way, so this is just who I am. But there's actually another way to relate to yourself. You can start treating your reactions as evidence, not identity. Evidence of what you value. Evidence of what you fear. Evidence of what you assume other people will do. Evidence of how young parts of you still try to run the show. When you do that, something really important happens. You stop being the defendant in your own mind, and you become the researcher. You're no longer asking, what's wrong with me? But you start to ask, what does this response tell me about the internal rules I'm living under? That's a different level of work. You already know what it feels like to be inside a surge. You know the pull to explain or attack, fix, shut down, or disappear. You know the familiar scripts. What you might not have done yet is look at those scripts and say, these are not proof of who I am. These are proof of what I learned. That shift takes you out of self-judgment and into self-study. And from here, your life becomes less about good or bad days and more about patterns that you're finally able to see. For example, if someone were to say, I notice that whenever someone is disappointed in me, I move toward either over-explaining or going completely silent. What rule does their system believe there? That's not drama, that's data. Another example would be someone saying, I notice that when I feel misunderstood, I immediately assume I'm about to be abandoned. Whose story is that? Where did I learn that disagreement equals disappearance? Again, it's not an attack, it's a clue. Once you start collecting this kind of evidence, you're no longer at the mercy of each moment. You're studying the design of your responses across moments. You begin to see that your reactions aren't random, they're loyal. They're loyal to old conclusions that were once logical, given what you lived through. They just might not be accurate anymore. And here's the thing, you're allowed to outgrow the internal rules that were written for a version of you who had fewer options than you have today. Rules like, if I slow down, I'll lose control. If I say what I really think, everything will fall apart. If I don't explain myself, I'll be discarded. If I don't respond immediately, I'll be unsafe. You don't argue with those rules, you test them. You notice in real time, I slowed down and nothing exploded. I spoke honestly and the relationship clarified itself instead of ending. I didn't respond to that provocation and my self-respect actually increased. Those are new data points. They belong in the file. This is where your work becomes genuinely helpful to you and not just cathartic. You're no longer feeling things and recovering from them. You're building an internal case file on yourself. What keeps repeating? What softens when it's seen? What only still exists because no one's questioned it in years? And slowly your definition of truth inside your own mind changes. Truth stops being whatever my nervous system screams first. And instead it becomes what still holds up after I've watched myself from a steadier place. That's a huge leap in development. It means you don't shame your first reaction. you also don't worship it. You don't ignore your emotion, but you also don't hand it the keys. You let your responses show you where the old map is still running, and then you decide whether you're still willing to live by that map. So it's not how do I fix myself, but what internal agreements am I still honoring that I never consciously signed? Arguments like, I will always make myself smaller so no one leaves. I'll always be the one who absorbs the tension. I will always sacrifice my clarity to keep the peace. I'll always move faster than my own understanding. You're allowed to revoke those. Not in one dramatic moment, but through 100 small choices where you no longer obey them. And every time you do that, your body gets new evidence. Maybe we're not living under those terms anymore. Maybe we're allowed to move differently now. That's the deeper transformation that this week opens the door to. Not just new reactions, but a new way of defining what counts as true inside of you. From this point on, if you want this work to really stay alive, you don't need more techniques. You just need better questions. Not was I right or wrong, but what was I protecting? Not did I handle that perfectly, but what did my response assume about me, about them, or about what always happens? Those kinds of questions move you forward. They keep you from turning this week into a performance and instead turn it into ongoing research on your own becoming. You're not here to just feel different for a few days. You're here to gather so much clear evidence about who you are now that the old story simply stops being believable. And then you stop arguing with your past and you start outgrowing it. People think change is about effort and discipline and rewriting habits. But the real shift happens when your nervous system finally says, I don't buy this anymore. And the mind falls silent because there's nothing left to defend. When the story collapses, your identity loosens. Your reflexes loosen. The conclusions that were welded in place suddenly feel optional. You begin to recognize that half of what you carried was never truth, it was repetition. And once repetition is exposed, it loses its authority. There's a strange kind of peace in that. You realize you were never fighting your patterns. You were fighting your loyalty to them. You were protecting a version of you that wouldn't survive the person you're becoming. You don't have to become the new you. You only have to stop performing the old one. Because what remains when the performance drops isn't emptiness, it's accuracy. A clearer mind, a cleaner motive, a quieter instinct. A voice that no longer tries to win because it no longer feels threatened by its own truth. The collapse of the old story creates a vacuum, and your system fills that vacuum with whatever is most honest. Not whatever's most rehearsed. Not whatever you were trained to believe, but whatever is real. And here's the dangerous thing about what's real. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you speak it, you can't unspeak it. Once you feel it without flinching, every lesser version of yourself becomes impossible to inhabit. That's why the old patterns feel heavier right now. Not because you're failing, but because your system refuses to settle for interpretations you've already proven as inaccurate. It's like trying to move back into a house after you've seen the foundation crack. You can force yourself inside, but you'll never convince yourself it's home. And here's the thing, when the story stops being believable, you stop being predictable. Not to others, to your past. Your triggers don't know what to do with you. Your fears can't find their usual footholds. Your familiar reactions fire, but you don't climb inside of them anymore. You watch them spark from a distance and you choose something else. Not because you're healed, but because you're accurate. You're not creating a new identity. You're remembering the parts of yourself that the old story never allowed to live. Your evolution doesn't begin when you feel ready. It begins when your old explanation for who you are no longer makes sense even to you. And that's where you're standing right now. In the blank space where the old story can't carry you. And the new story hasn't been written. But you already know you'll never go back. Because once the lie dissolves and truth doesn't have to fight for space, it expands on its own.